this presentation is really going to talk to you a little bit about Solomon. As I said, it is based upon my assignment, and my assignment's title was how was the reign of Solomon both a blessing and a tragedy to the people of Israel, and why did it divide so soon after his death? So, just to introduce Solomon a little bit, Solomon came to the throne after his father David. So he succeeded his father David in coming to the throne. He reigned for about 40 years as king over Israel. Most of his reign is recorded in 2 Chronicles and 1 Kings, so you can read about his reign in those scriptures. And most people will know or remember Solomon for 2 things. Firstly, his wisdom. All right, so his wisdom was something that was gifted to him from God, and we will talk about that a little bit later. And the other thing that most people remember him for is the building of the temple in Jerusalem. All right, so those 2 things are what most people remember Solomon for. But his story really was much bigger than that. Those 2 things really brought about quite a lot of blessings to Israel, but in fact, a lot of what he did actually ended up bringing great tragedy to Israel. So we're going to talk a little bit about both of those things, all of those things, how they brought blessings and Israel. So let's have a little look at what he did. One of the things he did is he built up huge political alliances with surrounding countries. Now, that was a great blessing to Israel because it meant that there was an increased amount of peace and prosperity, peace and political rest really within the area. David, his father, had fought long and hard really to increase the size of the land of Israel, and therefore during David's reign there wasn't much peace. But when Solomon came to reign as king, there was quite a lot of peace because he didn't really need to continue to fight the battles. He didn't really need to continue to extend the country, the kingdom. It was quite okay as it was, and he really just needed to consolidate what his father had done for him. So he did this basically by increasing the number of chariots that he used, and he also did it by developing treaties between other countries. So the treaties really were what formed the political alliances between the other countries, and they did bring great stability and great peace to the people of Israel. So that was a blessing obviously for them. But the treaties themselves actually turned out to be quite a tragedy because the treaties were often sealed through marriage. So Solomon sealed many of these treaties through marriage, and he ended up actually having 700 foreign wives during his reign, which was maybe just a little bit excessive. He allowed the wives, unfortunately, to continue to worship their own gods. So they were foreign wives, and they didn't worship Solomon's God or our God. They actually worshipped other gods. And Solomon allowed them to continue to worship other gods, and he actually built places of worship for them to continue to worship other gods. Now, they were actually very evangelical, I guess. They were very evangelistic about how they thought of their gods, and they actually convinced Solomon in the end to turn away from his God and actually worship their gods. Whereas unfortunately Solomon wasn't quite so evangelistic. He sort of just went with his wives, and I guess what you could say really is that his love for his wives in the end took over from his love from God, than his love for God, and they actually led him astray. So secondly is the wealth and prosperity of Israel. Israel had never seen wealth like they saw it within the reign of Solomon. He mostly brought this wealth through having big control of all of the trade routes that passed through the land. So people that passed through the land had to pay him taxes, and he had control over all of the trade routes. And this meant that wealth obviously flooded into Israel. They became a very wealthy kingdom. And for most people, it was considered the golden age. They were really living life well. But whenever wealth comes to a nation, what happens, unfortunately, is you get some class division, and that started to happen, and so that led to some disharmony amongst the people, because there started to be some of the lower class people, if you like, who were actually in a worse situation than they were when David was reigning. So although lots of people would call it the golden age of Solomon, it was for lots of them, but for the lower class people, it wasn't necessarily the case. Now, the wealth that came in, unfortunately, Solomon actually managed the wealth that came into the land, came into Israel, really quite poorly. So the wealth that initially seemed to be a great thing for Israel later went on to actually affect them in a negative way, because Solomon's lavish lifestyle and his lavish buildings and his great desire to continue to live that way meant that spending exceeded income. All right? So we all know ourselves, if spending exceeds income, your finances are not in a good place. So Solomon had to look for ways actually to solve that. He had to think how he could actually raise some more revenue for the country, because he didn't want to cut back on the way that he was living, and he didn't want to cut back on the lavish buildings he was building, so he decided that he would actually charge the people very high taxes. Now again, for some people they paid their taxes and that was fine, but obviously the poorer people, they struggled more with their taxes, and that caused some disharmony again. And he also had to come up with a way of collecting the taxes. So in order to collect the taxes, he introduced 12 administrative districts. Now the administrative districts broke down the old tribal boundaries. So you can imagine again, the old tribal boundaries are broken down, those tribes are divided up into 12 districts that have nothing necessarily to do with their tribal boundaries, and the people are put into these new groups, if you like. Over those people there was a governor whose responsibility was to A, collect the taxes, and B, the other thing that they had to do was provide for the king and the king's household all of the provisions that he needed. So each administrative district had 1 month of the year. Okay, so it's a bit like us as Baldivis having to provide to the city of Rockingham for 1 month of the year for, I don't know, what do we have, a mayor of the city of Rockingham, for all of his provisions that he needed. Okay, and then the next month it would be Rockingham's turn, and the month after it would maybe be Cronulla's turn if we were joined with them, and so on. But it was about each area had to actually provide for the king. Now, that again obviously caused some upset amongst the people, but Solomon was still at this point very well respected, very well honoured, very well thought of, despite some of the negative decisions that he was making that were impacting the people. So there wasn't rebellion and there wasn't uproar. The people sort of accepted it, even though they didn't necessarily agree with it. Thirdly, he was considered a master builder. So the big thing that brought blessing to many of the people of Israel during Solomon's reign was the building of the temple. Now the temple was originally the vision of David, but David handed that over to Solomon, the building. David hadn't really had a chance to build it. He'd been busy fighting wars and all of the rest of it. And so he handed the building of that over to Solomon. David had great faith that Solomon could actually do this. Despite the fact that he was young and despite the fact he was very inexperienced, David actually believed that he was God's man for the job to build the temple. And the temple brought huge blessing to Israel because it was the first time they'd ever had a building to worship God in. It was the first time they'd ever had a building to have teaching. So it was a huge blessing to them. It united them together as a faith. And at the time that it was built, Solomon was very dedicated to God. But it appears that his desire to build maybe got a little bit out of control. It appears that he got the building bug, he had a compulsion to build, and those buildings had to be lavish, and they had to be exotic, and they had to, they were almost a show of his status. It almost just got out of control. And that's why really his spending started to exceed his income. It would appear that at that point, after he's built the temple, he goes on to build these other lavish buildings, that he really had started to seek his own success. He had really started to want wealth for himself, want success for himself, want status for himself, and was really not necessarily being overly obedient to God in all of that. Finally, the fourth thing was his wisdom. Now, his wisdom was a blessing to the people of Israel. His wisdom was actually given to him. God came to him in a dream and said to him, what do you desire? As he's getting ready to be king, what do you desire? And he actually asked for the gift of wisdom and discernment, which was a great ask, very sensible ask, and God honoured that and gave him those, but he did also say to him that he could have wealth on top of that, because he'd made such a sensible or an honest or good request for the wisdom and the discernment. He knew he was going to need wisdom and discernment to rule the country, and his wisdom was considered far superior to any other of the wise people of his time. Now the people of Israel saw him in action, and they held him in high esteem because of that. So he solved quarrels, like the story of the prostitutes who both had a baby, lived in the same house, one died. They both claimed that the baby was theirs, and they took it to Solomon, and Solomon said, well, we'll cut the baby in half. All right. The real mother said, no, that's fine, give the baby to her, give the baby to the other mother. And Solomon could detect from that who the true mother was. So the people held him in high esteem and honoured him because of his wisdom. His wisdom was also endorsed by the Queen of Sheba. The Queen of Sheba visited him to discuss trade, but she also tested him, asked him many questions, and found him to be wise. And this led to a huge respect and honour internationally. So not just in the land of Israel, he was considered a wise man internationally. And that brought huge blessing to Israel in the form of strengthening it politically and also in wealth. Having said that, it would appear that at some point I don't think he necessarily lost his wisdom, but he stopped seeking God through all of his decisions. And so his decisions actually started to be dishonouring to God, move him away from God, disobedient to God. These decisions, like the decision to marry all of those wives, to increase the taxes, were really steps away from God's desire. They were steps in line with Solomon's desire, as opposed to being in line with God's desire. So he seemed to lose his passion, he seemed to become disobedient, and he seemed to, and the disobedience would bring eventual judgment and division for Israel. So why did the kingdom divide? Well, the kingdom did divide very shortly after Solomon's death, and Solomon was hugely responsible for that. It divided into Judah in the south and Israel in the north, and that was during the time of his son Rehoboam reigning. So why did this happen? Well, it may have been partly because Rehoboam really wasn't that great a king. He perhaps hadn't really been trained up. The question of whether David really changed Solomon that well, because if he had, would he have burnt out and stopped honouring God? Did Solomon, in his later years, when he wasn't actually being obedient to God, did he really train Rehoboam very well? All of that is questionable. The people of the north finally became rebellious, and it might be that they just saw their chance. They had put up with Solomon's high taxes and the providing of the provision for the king. Solomon died, and they thought, new king, let's give it a go, we'll rebel and see whether we can actually make the situation better for himself. Despite any of that, or through all of that, the division was actually a result of Solomon's disobedience to God. So Solomon stopped seeking what God wanted and started seeking what he wanted. And God said that he would judge him as a result of that. Deuteronomy 17:20 says, and he's talking about kings generally, he must not take many wives, or his heart will be led astray. He must not accumulate large amounts of silver and gold. When he takes the throne of his kingdom, he is to write for himself on a scroll a copy of the law, taken from that of the Levitical priests. It is to be with him, and he is to read it all the days of his life, so that he may learn to revere the Lord his God and follow carefully all the ways of this law and these decrees, and not consider himself better than his fellow Israelites. So that's really talking about the importance of the kings not going after girls, all right, or if you're a guy going after, if you're a girl going after guys and building up multiple wives of partners. It talks about not trying to bring success and glory for your own honour, but really make sure that the honour is going all back to God. And it's also talking about not seeking wealth for your own benefit. Solomon did all of those. So God's response really, and we can read in 1 Kings 11:11-13, although he had forbidden Solomon to follow other gods, Solomon did not keep the Lord's command. So the Lord said to Solomon, since this is your attitude, and you have not kept my covenant and my decrees, which I commanded you, I will most certainly tear the kingdom away from you and give it to one of your subordinates. Nevertheless, for the sake of David your father, I will not do it during your lifetime. I will tear it out of the hand of your son. So it was quite clear that this was going to be God's punishment because of Solomon's disobedience. And that's why soon after Solomon died, the kingdom divided, regardless of whether Rehoboam was going to be a good king or not. So what can we learn from all of this? Well, I guess the first thing we can learn is that we do need to look to God in all our decisions, not just the decisions that we want to look to him for. Secondly, that God calls us to obedience to his will, and that worship of him alone. So Solomon lost that really. He lost his obedience to God in marrying other wives, and he also started to worship other gods, moving away from what he was commanded to do. Thirdly, we can learn a little bit about the importance maybe of succession planning, the importance of actually training people up. You know, if Solomon had been trained a bit better, if David had taught him in the ways of God more, you know, maybe he would have lasted, who knows. But we have to accept that even as parents, when we try and implement that in training our children, at the end of the day, we've only got so much power in it that we can do that, and we have to trust it into God's hands. And lastly, don't lose focus. And don't put a higher value on material things, including buildings, than you do of God. Solomon put higher value on his wives, he put higher value on his buildings, he put higher value on his wealth, he put higher value on lots of things over God towards the end. And his heart was actually starting to turn away from, well, it did turn away from God. We need to remember that at the end of the day, a building is a building. And what God is interested in, it's not the lavishness of the building that we build, it's what's going on in the hearts of the people that are in that building. So we do need to remember that, and Solomon would be wise to have learnt that.